28. The engraving and the ambiguities of formalism. How was this supplementary substitution fatal? How is it fatal? How was it to be, for such is the time of its quiddity, what it necessarily is? What is the fissure that, within the origin itself, destines its appearance? This fissure is not one among others. It is the fissure, the necessity of interval, the harsh law of spacing. It could not endanger song except by being inscribed in it from its birth and in its essence. Spacing is not the accident of song. Or rather, as accident and accessory, fall and supplement, it is also that without which, strictly speaking, the song would not have come into being. In the dictionary, the interval is a part of the definition of song. It is therefore, so to speak, an original, one accessory and an essential accident. Like writing. Rousseau says it with t wishing to say it. Asterisk what he wishes to say is, accessory, accidental accident, the exterior outside, the supplementary evil or the accessory supplement. And space exterior to time. Spacing alien to the time of melody. As we shall see, even while saying that spacing assures the possibility of speech and song. Rousseau wishes to think of space as a simple outside by way of which disease and death in general, and especially the disease and death of sung speech, make their entry. He wishes to pretend that the fineness of inflections and of the oral accent did not already and always lend itself to spatialization, geometricization, grammaticalization, regularization, prescription, or to reason. As he wishes to efface this always already, he determines spacing as an event and as a catastrophic event. We shall have to come back more than once to the HAT concept of catastrophe. Let us note here that this catastrophe has indeed the form of philosophic reason. That is why the birth of philosophy during the epoch of Greek tragedy constitutes the best example of such a catastrophe. When the theatres had taken a regular form, all singing was according to prescribed modes. And, to the degree that the rules of imitation proliferated, imitative language was enfeebled. The study of philosophy and the progress of reasoning, while having perfected grammar, deprived language of its vital, passionate quality which made it so singeable. Composers, who originally were engaged by poets and worked only for them, under their direction so to speak, were becoming independent as early as the time of Melanipodes and Philoxenus. This is the license of which music complains so bitterly in a comedy of Phocrates, according to the passage preserved by Plutarch. Thus melody, originally an aspect of discourse, imperceptibly assumes a separate existence and music becomes more independent of speech. That is also when it stopped producing the marvels it had produced when it was merely the accent and harmony of poetry and gave to it the power over the passions that speech subsequently exercised only on reason. Thus, as soon as Greece became fond of sophists and philosophers, she no longer had any famous musicians or poets. In cultivating the art of convincing, that of arousing the emotions was lost. Plato himself, envious of Homer and Euripides, decried the one and was unable to imitate the other. Essay, pp 68-69. Further, according to the law of supplementary acceleration that we noticed above and that we could call the law of geometric regression, another catastrophe necessarily adds itself to the first. Almost all the significations that will constantly define the figure of evil and the process of its degeneration are recorded there, a simultaneously violent and progressive substitution of servitude for political freedom as freedom of the living word, dissolution of the small democratic and autarchic city, preponderance of articulation over accentuation, of consonant over vowel, of northern over southern, of the capital over the province. Going necessarily in the direction of the first catastrophe, the supplementary catastrophe nevertheless destroys its positive or compensating effects. Let us italicize, servitude soon joined forces with philosophy. In fetters, Greece lost the fire that warms only free spirits, and in praising her tyrants, she never recovered the style tone in which she had sung her heroes. The intermingling of the Romans further weakened whatever harmony and accent remained to the language. Latin, a less musical, more asserted mute tongue, did harm to the music in adopting it. The singing employed in the capital gradually corrupted that of the provinces. The Roman theatres harmed Nusirente those of Athens. When Nero carried off the prize, Greece had ceased to merit any. And the same melodiousness, parcelled between two tongues, had become less well suited to either. Finally came the catastrophe that disrupted the progress of the human spirit without removing the faults that were its product. Europe, flooded with barbarians, enslaved by ignoramuses, lost at the same time her sciences, her arts, and that universal instrument of both, that is, harmoniously perfected language. Imperceptibly, these coarse men engendered by the north made every ear accustomed to their rude voices. Their harsh, expressionless dinuity accent voices were noisy without being sonorous. The Emperor Julian compared Gallic speech to the croaking of frogs. All their articulations, like their voices, being nasal and muffled, they could give only some kind of distinctness to their singing, augmenting the vowel sounds to cover up the abundance and harshness of the consonants. Chap 19, Essay, p. 69j. In addition to the system of oppositions that controls the entire essay, servitude/political linguistic liberty, north/south, articulation/accent, consonant/vowel, capital/province/autarchic and democratic city, we may perceive here the strange workings of the historical process according to Rousseau. It never varies, beginning with an origin or a center that divides itself and leaves itself. An historical circle is described, which is degenerative in direction but progressive and compensatory in effect. On the circumference of that circle are new origins for new circles that accelerate the degeneration by annulling the compensatory effects of the preceding circle, and thereby also making its truth and beneficence appear. It is thus, by destroying the progress of the human spirit that the anterior cycle had produced, that the invasion of the northern barbarians ushered in a new cycle of historical degeneration. The harmful and dissolving effects of philosophy had in fact been limited by themselves. Their system comprised, in some way, its own curb. Within the following system or circle, that curb will have disappeared. Follows an acceleration of evil, which nevertheless will find a new internal regulation, a new organ of equilibrium, a new supplementary compensation, which will consist for example of reinforcing vowel sounds to cover the abundance and harshness of consonants, and thus to infinity. But this infinity is still not that of a horizon or an abyss, of a progress or a fall. It is the infinity of a repetition following a strange course. For the preceding diagram must be complicated further, each new cycle begins a regression which, destroying the effects of the preceding one, brings us back to a nature yet more secret, more ancient, more archaic. Progress consists always of taking us closer to animality while annulling the progress through which we have transgressed animality. I shall confirm it often. In any case, it would be difficult to represent the thus to infinity of this movement by the tracing of a line, however complicated that line might be. What cannot be thus represented by a line is the turn, trick/trope, of the return when it has the bearing of representation. What one cannot represent is the relationship of representation to so-called originary presence. The representation is als9 a presentation. It is tied to the work of Spock. Spacing insinuates into presence an interval which not only separates the different times of speech and of song but also the represented from the representer. Such an interval is prescribed by the origin of art as determined by Rousseau. According to a tradition that remains imperturbable here, Rousseau is sure that the essence of art is mimesis. Imitation redoubles presence, adds itself to it by supplementing it. Thus it makes the present pass into its outside. In the inanimate arts, the outside is split and it is the reproduction of the outside in the outside. The presence of the thing itself is already exposed in exteriority, it must therefore be presented and represented in an outside of the outside. In the living arts, and preeminently in song, the outside imitates the inside. It is expressive. It paints passions. The metaphor which makes the song a painting is possible, it can rest from itself and drag outside into space the intimacy of its virtue, only under the common authority of the concept of imitation. Painting and song are reproductions, whatever might be their differences, the inside and the outside share them equally. Expression has already begun to make passion go outside itself, it has begun to set it forth and to paint it. That confirms what we proposed above, imitation cannot allow itself to be appreciated by a simple act. Rousseau has need of imitation, he advances it as the possibility of song and the emergence out of animality, but he exalts it only as a reproduction adding itself to the represented though it adds nothing, simply supplements it. In that sense he praises art or mimesis as a supplement. But by the same token praise may instantly turn to criticism. Since the supplementary mimesis adds nothing, is it not useless? And if nevertheless, adding itself to the represented, it is not nothing, is that imitative supplement not dangerous to the integrity of what is represented and to the original per ity of nature? This is why, traveling along the system of supplementarity with a blind infallibility, and the sure foot of the sleepwalker, Rousseau must at once denounce mimesis and art as supplements that are dangerous when they are not useless, superfluous when they are not disastrous, in truth both at the same time, and recognize in them man's good fortune, the expression of passion, the emergence from the inanimate. It is the status of the sign that is marked by the same ambiguity. Signifier imitates signified. Art is woven with signs. In so far as signification seems to be, at first glance at least, nothing but an instance of imitation, let us come to Emile. The ambiguity of the treatment reserved for imitation in that book will clarify those passages in the essay that deal with the sign, art, and imitation. Pedagogy cannot help but encounter the problem of imitation. What is example? Should one educate by example or explanation? Should the teacher make an example of himself and not interfere any further, or pile lesson upon exhortation? And is there virtue in being virtuous by imitation? All these questions are asked in the second book of Emile. The problem at first is knowing how to teach generosity or liberality to the child. Even before the word and the theme of imitation occupy the front of the stage, the problem of the sign is posed. To teach the child true generosity is to make sure that he is not content only to imitate it. What does it mean to imitate generosity? It is to give signs in the place of things, words in the place of centime and ts, money in the place of real goods. Therefore the child must be taught not to imitate liberality, and this teaching must combat resistance. The child spontaneously wants to guard his goods and put one off the cent literally, give away the coin. Observe that the only things children are said to give are things of which they do not know the value, bits of metal carried in their pockets for which they have no further use. A child would rather give 100 coins than one cake. Emile, p. 67. What one gives easily is not signifiers inseparable from signifieds or things, it is the devalued signifiers. The child would not give away money so easily if he knew how to, or could, do something with it. But get this prodigal giver to distribute what is dear to him, his toys, his sweets, his own lunch, and we shall soon see if you have made him really generous. Emile, pages 97 to -99, p. 67. Not that the child is naturally greedy. He desires naturally to keep what he desires. It is normal and natural. Here vice or perversity would consist of not attaching oneself to things that are naturally desirable but to their substitutive signifiers. If a child loved money for money's sake, he would be perverse, he would no longer be a child. For Rousseau the concept of the child is always related to the sign. More precisely, childhood is the non-relation to the sign as such. But what is a sign as such? There is no sign as such. Either the sign is considered a thing, and it is not a sign. Or it is a reference, and thus not itself. According to Rousseau, the child is the name of that which should not relate in any way to a separated signifier, loved in some way for itself, like a fetish. This perverse use of the signifier is in a certain way at once forbidden and tolerated by the structure of imitation. As soon as a signifier is no longer imitative, undoubtedly the thread of perversion becomes acute. But already within imitation, the gap between the thing and its double, that is to say between the sense and its image, assures a lodging for falsehood, falsification, and vice. Hence the hesitation in Emile. On the one hand, everything begins with imitation and the child learns only by example. Here imitation is good, it is more human, it has nothing to do with aping. Those who, following Locke's argument, give children reasons for the advantage of being liberal rather than examples of liberality, would in fact be the deceptive ones. One will never pass from that usurious liberality to the true generosity that is transmitted only by example and good imitation. Teachers, have done with these shams, be good and kind, let your example sink into your scholars' memories until they can enter their hearts. Emile, p. 68j. But this good imitation already carries within itself the premises of its corruption alteration j. And all the problems of pedagogy in Emile may be summarized in this fact. The child is at first passive, the example engraves itself within the memory, waiting to enter the heart. It may remain in the memory without entering the heart, and conversely, because of the resemblance between the heart and memory, the child may feign feeling from the heart when he actually contents himself with imitating according to the signs of memory. He may always content himself with giving signs. A first time, good imitation may be impossible, a second time, it may be turned away from its good usage. Rather than hasten to demand deeds of charity from my pupil I prefer to perform such deeds in his presence, even depriving him of the means of imitating me, as an honor beyond his years. Emile, p. 68j. I know that all these imitative virtues are only the virtues of a monkey, and that a good action is only morally good when it is done as such and not because others do it. But at an age when the heart does not yet feel anything, you must make children copy the deeds you wish to grow into habits, until they can do them with understanding and for the love of what is good. Emile, p. 68j.35. The possibility of imitation seems thus to interrupt natural simplicity. With imitation, is it not duplicity that insinuates itself within presence? And yet, according to a scheme that we have already identified, Rousseau wished that good imitation should regulate itself according to a natural imitation. The taste for and power of imitation are inscribed within nature. Like pretense, if they are a corruption of imitation, vice and duplicity are not daughters of but diseases of imitation, are not its natural effect but a monstrous anomaly. Evil is a result of a sort of perversion of imitation, of the imitation within imitation. And that evil has a social origin. Man imitates, as do the beasts. The love of imitating comes from well-regulated nature. In Sakayat it becomes a vice. The monkey imitates man, whom he fears, and the oth are beasts, which he scorns. He thinks what is done by his betters must be good. Amongst us, on the other hand, our harlequins imitate all that is good to degrade it and bring it into ridicule. Knowing their own baseness they try to equal what is better than they are, or if they strive to imitate what they admire, their bad taste appears in their choice of models. They would rather deceive others or win applause for their own talents than become wiser or better. Emile, p. 68. Here the relationships among childhood, animality, and man in society order themselves according to the structure and problematics which we had such difficulty in outlining in the analysis of Pitting. And it is not by chance, the same paradox of the alteration of identity and of identification with the other is here at work. Imitation and pity have the same foundation, a sort of metaphorical ecstasy. Imitation has its roots in our perpetual desire to transport ourselves outside of ourselves. Ibid. Let us return to the essay. The Rousseau's OF metaphor now appear in the mythology of all the RTS. If art is imitation, it is essential to remember that everything in it signifies. In the aesthetic experience, we are affected not by things but by signs. No one doubts that man is changed by his senses. But instead of distinguishing the changes, we confuse them with their causes. We attach too much and too little importance to sensations. We do not see that frequently they affect us not merely as sensations, but as signs or images, and that their moral effects also have moral causes. Just as the feelings that a painting excites in us are not at all due to colors, the power of music over our souls is not at all the work of sounds. Beautiful, subtly shaded colors are a pleasing sight, but this is purely a pleasure of the sense. It is the drawing, the imitation, which gives life and spirit to these colors. The passions they express are what stir ours, the objects they represent are what affect us. Colors entail no interest or feeling at all. The strokes of a touching picture affect us even in a print. Without these strokes in the picture, the colors would do nothing more. Chap. 13. P053 If art operates through the sign and is effective through imitation, it can only take place within the system of a culture, and the theory of art is a theory of mores. A moral impression, contrary to a sensible impression, is recognized through the fact that it places its force in a sign. Aesthetics passes through a semiology and even through an ethnology. The effects of aesthetic signs are only determined within a cultural system. Unless the influence of sensations upon us is due mainly to moral causes, why are we so sensitive to impressions that mean nothing to the uncivilized? Why is our most touching music only a pointless noise to the ear of a West Indian? Are his nerves of a different nature from ours? Chap 15, Essay, p. 59. Medicine itself must take account of the semiological culture within which it must heal. As with the therapeutic art, the therapeutic effects of art are not natural inasmuch as they work through signs, and if the cure is a language, the remedies must make themselves understood to the sick through the code of his culture. The healing of tarantula bites is cited as proof of the physical power of sounds. But in fact this evidence proves quite the opposite. What is needed for curing those bitten by this insect are neither isolated sounds, nor even the same tunes. Rather, each needs tunes with familiar melodies and understandable lyrics. Italian tunes are needed for Italians, for Turks, Turkish tunes. Each is affected only by accents familiar to him. His nerves yield only to what his spirit predisposes for them. One must speak to him in a language he understands, if he is to be moved by what he is told. The cantatas of Berny are said to have cured the fever of a French musician. They would have given one to a musician of any other nation. Chap 15, Essay, p. 60 Rousseau does not go so far as to consider that the symptoms themselves belong to a culture and that the bite of a tarantula might have different effects in different places. But the principle of such a conclusio is clearly indicated in his explication. There is a single exception, which is more than simply strange, within this ethnosemiotics, cooking, or rather taste. Rousseau condemns gluttony without mercy. One might wonder why. I know of only one effective sense in which there is no moral element, that is taste. And, accordingly, gluttony is the main vice only of those who have no sense of taste, Ibid. Who have no sense of taste means here, of course, who do nothing but taste, who have nothing but uneducated and uncultivated sensations. As the value of virtuality or potentiality further introduces here an element of transition and confusion, of graduality, and of shifts within the rigor of distinctions and within the functioning of concepts limits of animality, childhood, savagery, etc. One must admit that moral impressions through signs and a system of differences can always be already discerned, although confusedly, in the animal. Something of this moral effect is perceivable even in animals. We realize the need for this hesitation in connection with pity, and at the same time with imitation. So long as one insists on considering sounds only in terms of the shock that they excite in our nerves, one will not attain the true principle of music, nor its power over men's hearts. The sounds of a melody do not affect us merely as sounds, but as signs of our affections, of our feelings. It is thus that they excite in us the emotions that they express, whose image we recognize in it. Something of this moral effect is perceivable even in animals. The barking of one dog will attract another. When my cat hears me imitate a mewing, I see it become immediately attentive, alert, agitated. When it discovers that I am just counterfeiting the voice of its species, it relaxes and resumes at rest. Since there is nothing at all different in the stimulation of the sense organ, and the cat had initially been deceived, what accounts for the difference? Ibid. From this irreducibility of the semiotic order, Rousseau also draws conclusions against the sensationalism and materialism of his own century. Colors and sounds can do much, as representations and signs, very little simply as objects of sense. Essay, p. 61j. The argument for art as signifying text is at the service of metaphysics and of spiritualist ethics. I believe that had these ideas been better developed, we should have been spared many stupid arguments about ancient music. Beauty in the century when all the operations of the soul have to be materialized, and even human feeling deprived of all morality. I am deluded if the new philosophy does not become as destructive of good taste as of virtue. Ibid. /I/1 must be attentive to the ultimate finality of the esteem which the sign enjoys. According to a general rule which is important for us, attention to the signifier has the paradoxical effect of reducing it. Unlike the concept of the supplement which, of course, signifies nothing, simply replaces a lack, the signifier, as it is indicated in the grammatical form of this word and the logical form of the concept, signifies a signified. One cannot separate its effectiveness from the signified to which it is tied. It is not the body of the sign that acts, for that is all sensation, but rather the signified that it expresses, imitates, or transports. It would be wrong to conclude that, in Rousseau's critique of sensationalism, it is the sign itself that exhausts the operation of art. /I/1 are moved, excited, by the represented and not by the representer, by the expressed and not by the expression, by the inside which is exposed and not by the outside of the exposition. Even in painting, representation comes alive and touches us only if it imitates an object, and, better, if it expresses a passion. It is the drawing, the imitation, which gives life and spirit to these colors. The passions they express are what stir ours. The strokes of a touching picture affect us even in a print essay, p. 53j. The engraving, art being born of imitation, only belongs to the work proper as far as it can be retained in an engraving, in the reproductive impression of its outline. If the beautiful loses nothing by being reproduced, if one recognizes it in its sign, in the sign of the sign which a copy must be, then in the first time of its production there was already a reproductive essence. The engraving, which copies the models of art, is nonetheless the model for art. If the origin of art is the possibility of the engraving, the death of art and art as death are prescribed from the very birth of the work. The principle of life, once again, is confounded with the principle of death. Once again, Rousseau desires to separate them, but once again, he accedes within his description and within his text to that which limits or contradicts his desire. On the one hand, in fact, Rousseau does not doubt that imitation and formal outline are the property of art, and he inherits, as a matter of course, the traditional concept of mimesis, a concept that was first that of the 5 essay on the origin of languages philosophers whom Rousseau one must remember one accused of having killed song. This accusation could not be radical one since it moved within the conceptuality inherited from this philosophy and of the metaphysical conception of art. The outline that lends itself to the print or engraving 1. The line which is imitated 1 belongs to all the arts 1 to the arts of space as much as to the arts of duration 1 to music no less than to painting. In both it outlines the space of imitation and the imitation of space. Music is no more the art of combining sounds to please the ear than painting is the art of combining colors to please the eye. If there were no more to it than that, they would both be natural sciences rather than fine arts. Imitation alone raises them to this level. But what makes painting an imitative art? Drawing. What makes music another? Melody. Chap 1.3, Essay, p. 5.5 The outline, design or melodic line, is not only what permits imitation and the recognition of the represented in the representer. It is the element of formal difference which permits the contents, colored or sonorous substance, to appear. By the same token, one it cannot give rise to literally provide space for art, technique, as mimesis without constituting it forthwith as a technique of imitation. If art lives from an originary reproduction 1 the outline that permits this reproduction, opens in the same stroke the space of calculation 1 of grammatically, of the rational science of intervals 1 and of those rules of imitation that are fatal to energy. Let us recall, and 1 to the degree that the rules of imitation proliferated 1 imitative language was enfeebled Essay 1 p. 68j. Imitation is therefore at the same time the life and the death of art. Art and death 1 art and its death are comprised in the space of the alteration of the originary iteration, iterum 1 anew, does it not come from Sanskrit itara, other, of repetition 1 reproduction, representation, or also in space as the possibility of iteration and the exit from life placed outside of itself. For the outline is spacing itself, and marking figures, it shapes the surfaces of painting as much as the time of music, the role of melody in music is precisely that of drawing in a painting. This is what constitutes the strokes and figures, of which the harmony and the sounds are merely the colors. But, it is said, melody is merely a succession of sounds. No doubt. And drawing is only an arrangement of colors. An orator uses ink to write out his compositions, does that mean ink is a very eloquent liquid? Chap 1.3, Essay, p. 5.3 Thus disengaging a concept of formal difference, criticizing with vigor an aesthetic that one might call substantialist rather than materialist, more attentive to sensory content than to formal composition 1 Rousseau yet places a great deal of the burden of art here music upon the outline. That is to say to what can give rise to cold calculation and the rules of imitation. According to a logic with which we are now familiar 1 Rousseau confronts that danger by opposing good form to bad form, the form of life to the form of death, melodic to harmonic form with imitative content to form without content, form full of sense to empty abstraction. Rousseau reacts against formalism. In his eyes formalism is also a materialism and a sensationalism. It is difficult to understand what is at stake in chapters 1.3 on melody and 14 on harmony if one does not perceive its immediate context, the polemic with Rameau. These chapters assemble and stylize a discussion developed in the corresponding articles of the Dictionary of Music and in the Examen de deux Principes Avances par Rameau dans essai brochure intitulé Erreurs sur la musique, dans l'encyclopédie, 1755, but this context serves only to reveal a systematic and permanent necessity. For Rousseau the difference between the melodic and harmonic form has a decisive importance. By all the features that distinguish them, they are opposed, as the life to the death of the song. Yet, if one thinks of the origin of the word, originally a proper name, and of the ancient treatises that we have remaining, harmony would be very difficult to distinguish from melody, unless one adds to the latter the ideas of ryhthm and measure, without which, in effect, no melody can have a determined character, whereas harmony has its own by itself, independent of every other quantity dictionary, pages 286 to 87. The difference proper to harmony must thus be looked for in the moderns, for whom it is a succession of concords according to the laws of modulation. The principles of this harmony have been assembled into systems only by the moderns. Examining that of Rameau, Rousseau reproaches him first for passing off as natural what is purely conventional. I ought however to declare, that this system, as ingenious as it may appear, is not in any way founded on nature, as he incessantly repeats it, that it is established only on analogies and conveniencies, which one, who is tolerable at invention, might overthrow tomorrow, by others much more natural. Dictionary Po 187. Rameau's fault is twofold, an artificialist exuberance and an illusory or abusive recourse to nature, an excess of arbitrariness which claims to be grounded solely in the physics of sound. One cannot deduce a science of series and intervals from simple physics. Rousseau's argument is noteworthy in many ways. The physical principle of the resonance presents to us the solitary concords and establishes not the succession. A regular succession is however necessary. A dictionary of chosen words is not an harangue, nor a collection of good concords a piece of music. A sense is wanting, and union in the music as well as language is necessary. Something of what precedes must be transmitted to what follows, that the whole may form a consonancy skillful congruity and may be truly one. Moreover, the composed sensation, which results from a perfect concord, is the essay on the origin of languages 2.1 solved in the absolute sensation of each of the sounds which compose it, and in the compared sensation of each of these intervals which these same sounds form between themselves. There is nothing beyond the sensible in this concord, from whence it follows, that it is only by the connection of the sounds, and the analogy of the intervals, that the union in question can be established. There lies the true and only principle, whence flow all the laws of harmony and modulation. If then, the whole of harmony was formed only by a succession of perfect major concords, it would be sufficient to proceed to them by intervals similar to those which compose such a concord, for then, some sound of the preceding concord being necessarily prolonged on the phonoing, all the concords would be found sufficiently united, and the harmony would be one, at least, in this sense. But besides that such successions would exclude the whole melody, by excluding the diatonic genus, which forms its base, they would not reach the true aim of the art, since music, being a discourse, ought, like it, to have its periods, its phrases, suspensions, stops, and punctuation of every kind, and as the uniformity of the harmonic courses presents nothing of these properties, the diatonic course required the major and minor concords to be intermixed, and we have felt the necessity of dissonances to mark the stops and phrases. Moreover, the united succession of perfect major concords neither gives the perfect minor concord, the dissonance, or any kind of phrase, and its punctuation appears entirely erroneous. Mons. Rameau, insisting absolutely, in his system, that all our harmony should be drawn from nature, has had recourse, for this purpose, to another experiment of his own invention. Ibid. The author italicizes only the word harmony. Rameau's mistake corresponds to the model of all mistakes and all historical perversions as they take shape under Rousseau's eyes. According to the circle, the ellipse, or the unrepresentable figure of the movement of history, cold rationality and abstract convention there join dead nature, the reign of physicality, a certain rationalism there mingles with materialism or sensationalism. Or empiricism, false empiricism, empiricism falsifying the immediate givens of experience. And this falsification that misleads reason is primarily a fault of the heart. If Rameau is mistaken 36 his errings are moral faults before being theoretical errors. One may read in the examination, I shall not pretend to avow that the work entitled Errors on Music seems to me in fact to crawl with mistakes, and that I see nothing more just in it than the title. But those errors are not in M. Rameau's reason, they have their source nowhere but in the heart, and when passion does not blind him, he will judge better than anyone the good rules of his art. The aberration of the heart which drives him to persecute 37 Rousseau can become a theoretical error only by making him deaf to the soul of music, melody and not harmony, by making him deaf a more serious accusation as musician as much as musicographer. I notice in the errors on music two of these important principles. The first, which guided M. Rameau in all his writings, and, what is worse, in all his music, is that harmony is the unique foundation of art, that melody derives from it, and that all the grand effects of music are born of harmony alone. Ibid. Rameau's aberration is a symptom. It betrays the sickness both of a history of the West and of European ethnocentrism. For harmony according to Rousseau is a musical perversion that dominates Europe, Northern Europe, alone, and ethnocentrism consists of considering it a natural and universal principle of music. The harmony that destroys the energy of music and shackles its imitative force melody is absent in the beginning of music, in illo tempore, and in non-European music, alibi. One wonders if Rousseau, conforming to a schema that we now know well, does not criticize ethnocentrism by a symmetrical counter-ethnocentrism and a profound Western ethnocentrism, notably by claiming that harmony is the evil and the science proper to Europe. 38 The good form of music, which, through representative imitation, produces sense while exceeding the senses, would be melody. One must, according to the same principle of dichotomy which is repeated endlessly, distinguish within melody itself a principle of life and a principle of death, and hold them carefully separated one from the other. Just as there is a good musical form, melody, and a bad musical form, harmony, there is a good and a bad melodic form. By a dichotomous operation that one must ever begin anew and carry further, Rousseau exhausts himself in trying to separate, as two exterior and heterogeneous forces, a positive and a negative principle. Of course, the malign element in melody communicates with the malign element of music in general, that is to say with harmony. This second dissociation between good and bad melodic form puts the first exteriority into question. There is harmony already within melody. LV1 has reference to two different principles, according to the manner in which we consider it. Taken in the connection of sounds, and by the rules of the mode, it has its principle in harmony, since it is in harmonic analysis which gives the degrees of the gamut scale, the chords of the mode, and the laws of the modulation, the only elements of singing. According to this principle, the whole force of melody is bounded to flattering the ear by agreeable sounds, as one flatters the eye by agreeable concords of colors, but when taken as an art of imitation, by which the mind may be affected with different images, the heart moved by different sentiments, the passions excited or calmed, in a word, moral effect be operated, which surpass the immediate empire of the sense, another principle must be sought for it, for we see no hold, by which the harmony alone, and whatever comes from it, can affect us thus. Dictionary, p. 227. What is there to say about this second principle? It must undoubtedly permit imitation. Imitation alone can interest us in art, concern us by representing nature and by expressing the passions. But what is it within melody that imitates and expresses? It is the accent. If we have lingered long in the debate with Rameau, it is also in order to delimit this notion of accent better. It will be indispensable for us when we come to it in the theory of the relationships between speech and writing. What is the second principle? It is in nature as well as the first. I italicize. Rousseau recognizes that harmony, the principle against nature, principle of death and of barbarism, is also in nature, but to discover it therein, a more nice observation is necessary, though more simple, and a greater sensibility in the observer. This principle is the same which makes the tone of the voice vary when we speak, according to the things we say, and the movements we use in speaking. It is the accent of the language which determines the melody in each nation. It is the accent which makes us speak while singing, and speak with more or less energy, according as the language has more or less accent. That, whose accent is most expressed, should produce a melody more lively and more passionate. Thou which has little or no accent, can have only a cold and languishing melody, without character or expression. Herein are the true principles. Dictionary, p. 228, italics added. The essay, and notably the 3 chapters on the origin of music, on melody, and on harmony, which thus follow the order of growth, may be read according to the same pattern. But the concept of the supplement is this time present in the text, named even though it is never, as it nowhere is, expounded. It is indeed this difference between implication, nominal presence, and thematic exposition that interests us here. The chapter on melody proposes the same definitions, but it is not without significance that the pedagogic argumentation that introduces them is totally derived from an analogy with an art of space, painting. The point is first to show by this example that the science of relations is cold, without imitative energy, like the calculation of intervals within harmony, while the imitative expression of meaning, of passion, of the thing as it interests us, is the true living content of the work. Let us not be surprised to see Rousseau place design on the side of art, and colors on the side of science and the calculation of relationships. The paradox is apparent. By design, one must understand condition of imitation; by color, natural substance, whose physical play can be explained by physical causes and can become the object of a quantitative science of relationships, of a science of space and of the analogical disposition of intervals. The analogy between the two arts music and painting appears thus, it is analogy itself. These two arts carry a corruptive principle, which strangely enough is also in nature, and in both cases, that corruptive principle is linked to spacing, to the calculable and analogical regularity of intervals. Thus, in both cases, whether music or painting, whether it is the scales of music or the scales of color, the harmony of tone as visible or audible nuance, the rational calculation of harmonics is a chromatic, if one understands that word in the larger sense, beyond what one specifies with respect to the fact of the scale and the bass part in music. Rousseau does not use the word in the essay, but the analogy does not escape him in the dictionary. Chromatic, adjective sometimes taken substantively. A kind of music which proceeds in several consecutive semitones. This word is derived from the Greek chroma, which signifies color, either because the Greeks mark these notes with red characters, or differently colored, or, according to authors, because the chromatic kind is a medium between the two others, as color is between black and white, or according to others, because this kind varies and embellishes the diatonic by its semitones, which, in music, produces the same effect as the colors in painting. Post 6.1. The chromatic, the scale gamma J, is to the origin of art what writing is to speech. And one will reflect on the fact that gamma is also the name of a Greek letter introduced into the system of literal musical notation. Rousseau wishes to restore a natural degree of art within which chromatics, harmonics, and interval would be unknown. He wishes to efface what he had furthermore, and elsewhere, already recognized, that there is harmony within melody, etc. But the origin must, should, have been, such as, here and elsewhere, the grammar and the lexicon of the relationship to the origin, pure melody, the first tales, the first speeches, the first laws, were in verse. Poetry was devised before prose. That was bound to be, since feelings speak before reason. And so it was bound to be the same with music. At first, there was no music but melody and no other melody than the varied sounds of speech. Accents constituted singing. Italics added. Essay, pages 50 to 51 but just as in painting the art of design is degraded when the physics of color is substituted for it. L9 So in the song melody is originally corrupted by harmony. Harmony is the originary supplement of melody. But Rousseau never makes explicit the originarity of the lack that makes necessary the addition of the supplement, the quantity and the differences of quantity that always already shape melody. He does not make it explicit, or rather he says it without saying it, in an oblique and clandestine manner. And reading it, it must be surprised at this work of contraband. If I may add a passage from the Confessions here, point 40 in the passage of the essay that we have just cited, the definition of the origin of music was developed in this way, without the contradiction or the impurity becoming its themes. Accents constituted singing, quantity constituted measure, and one spoke as much by sounds and rhythm as by articulations and words. To speak and to sing were formerly one, says Strabo, which shows that in his opinion poetry is the source of eloquence. It should be said that both had the same source, not that they were initially the same thing. Considering the way in which the earliest societies were bound together, is it surprising that the first stories were in verse and the first laws were sung? Is it surprising that the first grammarians subordinated their art to music and were professors of both? Italics added, p51 we shall have to relate these propositions to analogous ones, those of Vico for example. For the moment I am interested in the logic proper to Rousseau's discourse, instead of concluding from the simultaneity that the song broached itself in grammar, that difference had already begun to corrupt melody, to make both it and its laws possible at the same time, Rousseau prefers to believe that grammar must, should, have been comprised, in the sense of being confused with, within melody. There must, should, have been plenitude and not lack, presence without difference. From then on the dangerous supplement, scale, or harmony, adds itself from the outside as evil and lack to happy and innocent plenitude. It would come from an outside which would be simply the outside. This conforms to the logic of identity and to the principle of classical ontology, the outside is outside, being is, etc., but not to the logic of supplementarity, which would have it that the outside be inside, that the other and the lack come to add themselves as a plus that replaces a minus, that what adds itself to something takes the place of a default in the thing, that the default, as the outside of the inside, should be already within the inside, etc. What Rousseau in fact describes is that the lack, adding itself as a plus to a plus, cuts into an energy which must, should, have been and remain intact. And indeed it breaks in as a dangerous supplement, as a substitute that enfeebles, enslaves, effaces, separates, and falsifies. Even if one spent 1,000 years calculating the relations of sounds and the laws of harmony, how would one ever make of that art an imitative art? Where is the principle of this supposed imitation? Of what harmony is it the sign? And what do chords have in common with our passions? But in the process it also shackles melody, draining it of energy and expressiveness. It wipes out a face passionate accent, replacing substitute j with the harmonic interval. It is restricted to only two types of songs, within which its possibilities are determined by the number of oral tones. It eliminates a face et de many sounds or intervals which do not fit into its system. Thus in brief, it separates singing from speech, setting these two languages against each other to their mutual deprivation of all authenticity v.right, so that it is absurd for them to occur together in a pathetic subject. Italics added, yet once again, I emphasize particularly the strange association of the values of effacement and substitution, essay, pages 57 to 58. What does Rousseau say without saying, see without seeing? That substitution has always already begun, that imitation, principle of art, has always already interrupted natural plenitude, that, having to be a discourse, it has always already broached presence in difference, that in nature it is always that which supplies nature's lack, a voice that is substituted for the voice of nature. But he says it without drawing any conclusions. By itself, harmony is insufficient even for those expressions that seem to depend uniquely on it. Thunder, murmuring waters, winds, tempests, are but poorly rendered by simple chords. Whatever one does, noise alone does not speak to the spirit at all. The objects must speak in order to be understood. In all imitation, some form of discourse must substitute for the voice of nature. The musician who would represent noise by noise deceives himself. He knows nothing of either the weakness or the strength of his art, concerning which his judgment is tasteless and unenlightened. Let him realize that he will have to render noise in song, that to produce the croaking of frogs, he will have to have them sing. For it is not enough to imitate them, he must do so touchingly and pleasantly. Otherwise, his tedious imitation is nothing, and will neither interest nor impress anyone. Italics added, essay, p58.